So today, what is our value?
Stewardship.
Yeah, stewardship. What is our tagline for stewardship?
Or what?
What's the short one for stewardship?
Like time, talent, and treasure.
What's that?
Like giving your time, talent, and treasure.
Well, let's look at the. So what is it?
So, no.
You got to become the master of the saying no without no, right? Like, yeah, Okay, so what's the phrase? Let's just read it aloud first. Do you want to volunteer to read? Wonderful.
We believe the Lord God made all things and called them good. To care for creation and the goods of this place are time, talent, and treasures as gifts from God.
So, what is stewardship?
Caring for creation.
Yeah, care, treating things with care, right? Like being good stewards of the gifts that surround you is stewardship. And then it has the quote from the it's from the Benedictine Rule, the RB, right? Okay, just making sure. What was the what's the quote here? I like this quote.
Regard all utensils and goods as sacred vessels of the altar.
So what's the image? What's the image here? Have you ever, in your Sunday school classes when you're young or anything, learn about like the temple? Yeah, so like, in the temple there's like essentially like all these objects, right, that are sort of like have to be treated in very specific ways, right? And then at the highest point of that you get the holiest of holies where there's a curtain and only one person in the country is allowed to go in there once a year, right? So thinking about like talking about using it as if they were vessels of the altar, right? So like if the image is like we should treat all things with the kind of care, right, that we would treat something that is in some way sacred. Another way to put it is like, and it's kind of like the point of the quote, if you think about all things are made by God and called good. In some ways, all things are sacred and should be treated as such. It's kind of the image there, right? Okay, so treating all things as sacred, how does that connect with college, right? No. So here we have our habit of mind, like usual. What's our habit of mind?
Gathering data through the senses and responding with wonderment and awe.
Yeah, so it's and they give a variety of ways in which this happens, but basically like as we gather information, like in using senses broadly here, because it also talks about like reading these paragraphs, right? Like as we gather information, we should treat it with the due sensitivity it deserves, right? One of the ideas that they talk about is the intellectual stewardship idea, right? So like when you learn, what are you stepping into?
New information.
You're stepping into new information, but where does that information come from? So as you come to classes and you learn, where does all this information come from? You go into any given class. You have one person who's an expert in something telling you about that thing that they're an expert in for 3 hours, 6 hours a week, 3 hours a week, right? For 15 weeks, right? Where does all this information come from? Do we just make it up? Whatever we think. Where's it coming from?
A lot of it comes from like human reason and like knowledge over time that we've kind of built up.
Yeah. So when you go into classes, you're talking about countless hours of other people's work, right? So you should treat that with the respect it deserves. Like people, like hundreds of thousands of people has dedicated their lives to understanding things to get that to you. If you think about it that way, right? So intellectual stewardship, like you're stepping into a tradition, right? You should treat that to some degree with the respect it deserves, right? Also, like, you should treat the things you learn from other sources, like from your senses, with what it deserves. What popped into my head when going through this, do you guys mind if I go on like kind of a super nerdy rant?
I don't mind though.
Okay, cool.
So,
So there's a, has anyone ever heard of Immanuel Kant?
Yes.
Kant. So Immanuel Kant, he's, one of the things that he's famous for a lot of things, is an idea that later gets called the categorical imperative. Has anyone ever heard of the categorical imperative? Wonderful. So according to the categorical imperative, like, we have no access to, and this is just an idea, so don't take this as anything but, we have no access to what Kant calls the world in and of itself. Which he uses, I'm going to avoid the, well, no, I won't, because you'll probably come across these later on. So this is called a posteriori. So how it kind of works is like, you know, you have a world out there. This is going to be my bad realist tree. And so, you're a person. I'm a bad drawer, by the way. Not an artist. That's strange, Jen. It kind of looks like an alien, I know.
Is this supposed to be a question?
Yes.
Yeah, that's my human.
Okay.
So whenever you interact with something,
Just waiting for it.
so whenever a human individual or an alien, whatever, interacts with something, right? You first take it in through your senses, right? And then you filter it through other things, right? So you filter it through the way your mind works. So we can make a little brainstem there. You filter it through your culture, right? If you think about when we were talking about language, right? Like you filter it through your culture, right? And so whatever comes out the other side, right, is not going to be, in a pure way, the thing that you see, right? So that's a posteriori, before knowledge. This is a priori, right? So basically what Kant's saying is that the world, and this is what I want to pull out to it, the world is far too complicated for us to even understand it. So the world, to some degree, is filled with infinite complexity. Right? It's too much information for us to absorb. There's another philosopher, Hegel, who uses a phrase, and I think this is a good way to put it. He says, "In perfect light, one sees as little as in utter darkness." Right? So, like, you cannot know things because of too much information. You can not know things because you don't know anything. Right? The point is this: is that the world is too complex for you to understand. So understanding actually comes from this weird reduction of information. So like your eyes reduce what you see, right? You see a certain color spectrum. If you were a different animal, you would see something completely different, right? You know, but what you see, right, is real, It's a real thing, right? So this doesn't cast doubt on the existence of the tree, but you see a simplification of a tree. You don't see the tree in and of itself. You don't see, and sometimes he calls the world in and of itself, he refers to this as God's view. Right? So for Kant, this would be like how God views the world. It would be a world of infinite complexity that he can understand. But for human beings, like, we filter it, right? And that allows our sort of finite little minds to wrap our head around the world, right? In the same way that we have to have thoughts to understand things, right? We have to have existing cultural knowledge for us to understand that. So why am I bringing that up, right? So kind of like in the same way that we were talking about like this long tradition and having to treat it with respect, we should to some degree treat the rest of the world as a mysterious place, right? Whose complexity we could never actually fathom, right? So to some degree, like, the world is deserving of our respect, right? We use our senses to understand the world. We shouldn't assume that understanding is going to be easy, right? In a lot of ways, like all the things that we're taught, like when this is sort of like where it talks about not understanding it through sort of like bias or political perspectives, right? But allowing the world to kind of like to some degree act upon us, right? To treat it with that sort of sense of awe and wonder, to explore it, right? There's an infinite amount of things for you to explore. Around us are narratives which want to shut down that exploration. That want to essentially create a world that's far more simple than what it is, right? And to some degree, like the idea of like you gather information, but you should do so with this sort of feeling of awe and wonderment. That make sense? Yeah.
So would like the sciences be counted as a way of simplifying the world?
Yeah, yeah.
It's like if you look at something through like a physics perspective or something, it's like it's a huge simplification of everything that's going on.
And to some degree, it's designed to be that, right? So like, yeah, if you think about like, does anyone here like to like go for like nature walks? So like, have you ever like stood on a bridge overlooking a river, particularly a river that's moving? Like you.
the Amelia Earhart Bridge.
Yeah, like you could go to Amelia Earhart, or you just the bridge over here. You just hop up on it. I don't think you can walk on it, but maybe someday you can.
The one that like
Is there?
Yeah, because one time I was driving into Missouri and there was some lady walking on the side and I was like, I'm gonna join her because I really want to walk on that bridge. So
Yeah.
if you guys see me on that bridge, mind your own business.
Yeah, so you stand at the top of the bridge and look out over the Missouri River, right? Like, the Missouri River, it's influenced by all sorts of things. So if you want to understand how that river is flowing and moving, like, it's almost I'm not saying it is, right? So I'm not answering more about it, but it's almost a living organism, right? Like, there's, the wind acts on it differently, there's different flows in the ground and the forces that acts upon it, but getting back to, like, the idea of physics, right? Physics can't absorb that information, right? It's too complex. So what it does is it finds a way of simplifying that, in some ways like stopping that, if you will, stopping that life, dissecting it, right? So that it can analyze it. And that's good, it's a good tool, right? But yeah, it's always going to be a simplification. It's always a way of looking at the world. And knowledge is created by the destruction of information. You feel this like, some of you guys, anybody here for those of you who know what they want to go into, anybody here have to take statistics?
No.
I think about this in like people always ask for raw data. And you're like, oh, raw data means absolutely nothing. It's a whole bunch of lines on a spreadsheet that is utterly unintelligible, right? It only has meaning after two things happen. Right? It only has meaning after you use a mathematical formula to reduce that information into something you can interpret. And then that only has meaning after you've interpreted it. Right? So you think about it like really what you're talking about is like you take a survey like the General Social Survey, which is like always done in the United States to gather, it's a big series of schools and nonprofits that gather it together. It's the largest survey in the United States. So like they go around and they collect tons of information from people all over the United States. So, you know, you have about what their attitudes and thoughts are, right? So you have people's attitudes and thoughts over here, utterly unintelligible, right? There's way too much of us, there's too many weird patterns and flows, you can never know it, right? It's that river moving down, right? So what do? You take a sample of that, and then you collect all that information, and that information is reduced through your survey, whatever questions you ask, right? So there you go, it's like basically 2 more series of reductions. That's unintelligible. So then you have to run mathematics on it. That's unintelligible, and then you have to interpret it. So you're thinking about it like it's fractured, 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 right? But getting back to the point is like, if that's what it takes for us to understand it, like we are sort of programmed in terms of our consciousness to assume that we already know what's going on in the world, because otherwise we get too much cognitive dissonance, right? But in reality, like, that's a trick. It's a mental trick. To some degree, that's like the structuring of our brain, telling us, no, everything's okay. You do understand things. But in reality, like, you get a very narrow piece of what's out there. So to some degree, we should always be struck by the awe of all the things that we don't understand, and all the things that we don't know. And to some degree, we talked about doubt before, right? This is to some degree like a habit, a valuable habit, right? Like, that's kind of how it pairs together. Like, you should have doubt, because like, the things of this world are bigger than you. You're a small jar trying to fit the ocean inside of it, and you'll never do it. But to some degree, yeah, it deserves that kind of respect. Any questions or thoughts people have on the reactions? I know I just like totally took this over and turned it into a philosophy class, but.
Bring it to my physics class and be like, excuse me, Dr. S, are we really experiencing this with Wonder Woman? Because according to Kant, like...
I don't know what it is. Oh, you're saying you're...
bring it into my physics class.
We're like, we're gonna go sit outside.
I'm gonna go sit outside and look at a tree, excuse me.
Well, actually, Kant is one of the founders of like modern science.
Really?
No,
So like, actually, like, the idea is almost that, like, but he had this, I'm going to just bracket that. He's one of the founders of modern science. I'm not going to explain why.
There's my whole argument.
What's that?
There's my whole argument.
There goes your whole argument. Does it, well, and science can be definitely like,
Yeah,
like,
it really can.
it really like can be something that sort of teaches you about the intricacies of things, right?
Yeah.
So you think about like, biology, like all the things that goes into a body of something, right? That like on the surface, like we don't know, right? And like you think about how much complexity ends up being down when we start getting into like, now we're talking about cells being made up of matter, being made up of atoms, being made up of subatomic particles, being made up of quarks, and who knows what else is in that, right? Like how amazing is all of that, right? Like, so like I think, yeah, totally like depending on your eyes, depending on how you're filtering it, right? Science can definitely be something that fills you on the other end in your little thought bubble with awe and wonderment about what you're seeing. And it's a great reductionary tactic, so it allows you to actually see. Okay. Questions or thoughts still? Comments? Worries?
It just reminds me a bit about, my roommate was reading about the, something of the creature, an essay he had to read,
Yeah.
The Loss of the Creature. And he explained it to me, and it sounds a bit similar where it's, when you look at a wolf for the first time, you're not thinking, oh, well, what is this? And you're trying to piece together information that you're collecting. Rather, it's more, you take from your mind all those stories of wolves in your mind, and you're fitting that wolf into it. So,
Yeah.
just a connection I made.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, yeah. That we to some degree, it's easy to lose sight of the thing that's actually out there. Yeah. Sorry, I was just processing. Other thoughts. go ahead and take a look at our poem. Anyone here like poetry? Big poetry readers?
I prefer haikus.
Why is that?
They just make more sense in my head. More fun. I don't have to rhyme.
That's fair.
Just counting.
Well, a lot of poetry you don't rhyme.
No, I like the poetry that rhymes.
You like poetry that rhymes?
Yeah, or like has like a good rhythm to it, you're like, yes, get it.
There's like one choice here that I really like in terms of like the setup of the stanzas. So okay, I think we should just like start reading it line by line and offer our interpretations of, we'll do a reader response. Wants to, or do you guys want me to read it, 'cause it's poetry?
Yeah,
Cadence is
We'll have a
kind of,
professional reader.
Yeah.
I'm not a poet though.
Oh, okay.
Like I'm really good at reading really dry stuff that nobody else wants to read. That and I'm good at like taking things like, I don't know, like some racist piece of literature from the 1800s and dissecting it. It's not really the same skill set as poetry. Okay, so the world is charged with the grandeur of God. It will flame out like shining from shook foil. So let's take the images. What's the image there? So first, obviously, the first one is like its thesis statement, if you will, right? Like the world is charged with the glory of God is a big, one of the big themes in this poem, right? So what's the image of it? What's our image here?
The shook foil.
The shook foil. What is that?
I just looked up a picture and not quite sure, still not gonna lie. Looks kinda gold.
What's foil? Yeah.
Does like the light reflect off of it so then it like shines out? So he's basically saying like everyone will see kind of the grandeur in the world shining out.
I think that could definitely be part of it. I think that's definitely part of what's going on here. Why foil?
It's really shiny.
And it's flat metal that you can like shake around.
Yeah. So what happens if you think about if we had light, I had like a massive piece of tin foil, or maybe something shiner, like maybe like that like golden space foil, and I shook it, and what would happen? Yeah, light would be bouncing off all. That's the image, right?
It would be better than disco party.
Yeah.
I don't know about that, but.
Yeah, if this was written in the mid-70s rather than the Victorian era, it might read, it'll flame out like a giant disco ball. Yeah. Not nearly as poetic, but But then it wouldn't have to rhyme in the next verse, so Okay, so what's our next, oh, sorry. You wanted me to read it. It gathers to a greatness like ooze of oil. This is the moment I like. Pause. Crushed. Nice setup. So okay, what's our image here?
A bunch of oil. Ooze.
What kind of oil do you think this is? What kind of oil do you have to crush?
I mean, in my mind, I immediately go to olive oil because you have to crush olives to get the oil.
Yeah, I think it's a reference. So it's not like it's not like Beverly Hillbillies, black gold Texas tea bubbling up from the ground. That's not the image here, right? The image here is crushing, like crushing olives or other things that you would crush to get oil. Coconut, flax seeds, whatever. So rendering the oil through being crushed, right? And then that oil like gathers to something, right? So like if you think about like, have you ever seen people crush like your example, olive oil. Have you ever seen anyone make olive oil? There's like this vat, right, that it goes down sort of funneling thing, so it's gathering like the oozing oil running down. All right, that's kind of the image here. At least as I read it. Does anybody else have a different interpretation? I'm not a poetry interpreter, so leap in, harangue me for saying things that are wrong. Why do then men now not wreck his rod? Generations have trod, and all is smeared with trade, blurred, smeared with toil. And wears man's smudge, and shares man's smell, the soil. Pausing soon. Really, I should have paused before
Well,
the soil.
Maybe it's like how on the last line of that stanza it mentions, nor can foot feel being shod, that we can't really feel the natural world because we put shoes on, we cover ourselves from it, and we leave on mark on the world, as it says, man's smudge.
Yeah, so yeah, one like, yeah, well, the soil is bare now, nor can foot feel being shod. Being shod is being. So there's this, we remove ourselves from the natural world. And what do we do to the natural world? What are some of the, so let's start image by image. So so we finished with that crushed, right? Which is also kind of an interesting play here, because crushed becomes the first part of the next stanza, right? So like it's the last part of that sentence, but it becomes the first part. So it gathers to a greatness like the ooze of oil, crushed. So it's both the finishing of a thought and the start of a new one, right? So then crushed becomes the theme, just like the world is charged with the grandeur of God is like our first theme. Now in some ways our second theme is crushed, right? So crushed. Why do men now not wreck his rod? In other words, like why is it that the first statement, right, is not? That's how I'm interpreting that. Anybody else have a different one for that?
Yeah, I feel like it's kind of touching on kind of the balance between appreciation of nature and industry, because it's like it's kind of something that's like in human nature to like build and to like make nature kind of make nature according to their own way of doing things. Like when we build something, that's what we're doing. We're taking a tree, we're cutting it down, we're turning it into a square, and put that up so we have a place to live.
Yeah.
There's something fundamentally human and fundamentally satisfying about that. But also, we lose something a lot of the time in there. And it's interesting that it uses oil, because in order to make oil, it's a product of human industry. It's a product of taking something natural, like an olive, and like crushing it down, but it still makes something beautiful.
I don't know, I got part of this from from the next stanza as well, but I mean like when I first read it, it was, it's like, because the first half of it is about like God, and then the second half is like man's effect, so like, I don't know, he's almost like asking like how does man not stamp out God's like grandeur from nature? Yeah,
that was my interpretation of it. Yeah, I think both are probably like good. Like there's a more of a tension here. It's a yes and rather than an either or, right? So yeah, I think that there is the natural world persists. We'll see that later, right? Despite our destructiveness of it, but our destructiveness is still destructive, right? It's seared with trade, right? You think about like what's happening in the Victorian period, right? We're getting this period of basically the birth of industrialization, to some degree the birth of the rape of the natural world, right? So he's looking out on this in some ways and seeing that destructiveness here, right? That it's blurred, smeared, seared, right? These are all very harsh verbs, right? We're out of time. We're 1 minute over. So. I can't keep you guys any longer than that. You guys want to finish this poem when we get back next week?
For sure.
Okay, cool.
Sounds good.
Everyone have a good week.
Thank you.